All right, so welcome to this month's edition of Ballotpedia Insights. This one is a fun one for me. All of the Ballotpedia staff are, of course, connected to both the civics world and the tech world in different ways. And a few people on staff have very mutual interests in different podcasts, including ReplyAll. So I think I was driving somewhere on a Sunday morning a few weeks ago and saw the latest podcast titled Candidate One pop up on their feed. I thought, oh my gosh, there was previously one about Alabama's Democratic Party that was just fascinating. I'm going, what is this? And then I hear our guest today, Robert Ezra Stern, talk about all of the elections commission work that he was doing at Berkeley High School. So it's kind of it's a little bit of a breakaway from our normal insights, but I thought it'd be fun to take a step back from the daily 2020 grind and just talk about fun topics like elections reform. As I mentioned at the top of this, there's a lot going on with that. Please excuse the cat. I can't lock him away in a room or he goes berserk. So today we have Robert Ezra Stern, and I'll give you his bio, which he submitted to me, and I didn't tweak it all because I think it's perfect. So Robert Ezra Stern is a rising second-year student at the University of Chicago and a member of the university's Elections and Rules Committee. Previously, he served for 2 years as Commissioner of Elections at Berkeley High School and for 5 years as a youth baseball umpire. I really empathize with that. I was a Parks and Rec League soccer ref for a while, and a job for which he was paid in hot dogs. That sounds very familiar. His efforts to prevent large-scale voter fraud in the BHS elections were recently featured on the ReplyAll podcast. In the 2020 primaries, he unintentionally spoiled his ballot by voting for an ineligible write-in candidate in an uncontested state Senate race. First, Robert Ezra, thanks for joining us. Can I confirm that was Kanye West?
No, it was the former mayor of Berkeley, who I thought would be funny if I voted for him in a race that didn't matter, for reasons that I'm not sure I understand anymore.
I think we've all done that when there's not a candidate that we're particularly interested in. So, all right, so probably a lot of our listeners have not heard this podcast. Of course, I do encourage you to go on to ReplyAll and take a listen to, I believe it's 3 podcasts ago, called Candidate One. But can you walk the audience through a little bit about what your initial role was in the Berkeley High School elections? Kind of take us back to a few years ago and what you were up to.
Sure, yeah. So I was in charge of running the student body election at my high school. And what essentially happened was someone committed fraud, and it was incredibly obvious that they had done that. And I basically, in my role of running the election, I was in a position to observe it, and I observed it, and then everyone said how great I was for observing it.
All right, so I've got to ask, because the phrase "who guards the guardians" comes to mind. How did you get into that role at your high school? Was there an elections for you, or what brought you to that
Sure,
role?
yeah. So it was a part of student government. There's it's by application, and it's appointed by the student body president and vice president in conjunction with the director of student activities, who's the faculty member who sort of runs the student government program. It doesn't have the greatest oversight. Theoretically, the president could just appoint whoever they want and could appoint someone that just rigs the election in their favor, and that's it. One of the things that actually the proposal that I made that I'm pretty sure got me the job was, let's not let the commissioner of elections run for anything. The year before I was commissioner of elections for the first time, I was there for 2 years. Actually, the commissioner of elections ran for president and was not allowed to count the votes. Basically, they signed up to do a job and then did something that conflicted with their ability to do that job, which, to me seems like a waste of time, because it was decided that they had to forfeit their position. This is, by the way, not a revolutionary reform, I would say. Actually, the system that I was dropped into at the University of Chicago takes this for granted, that the person counting the votes can also be one of the people being voted on. but it's a high school. You know, they don't really have a strong set of rules. I had to dig somewhere to find the Constitution when we were looking at alternatives for resuming the election after a fraud. So, you know, it's a high school. Do they have robust election infrastructure? No. Should they? No.
How long is the high school's constitution?
I don't know. It's probably like 2 or 3 pages. I think it's 2 or 3 pages, and then there's like 10 pages of descriptions of what the role of each officer is in the meetings that they have to go to, which I was commissioner of elections for 2 years. The first year I attended every meeting, and then the second year I essentially put in my application, I'm the best candidate for the job, you know it. I promise I won't show up to the meetings. You have to appoint me anyway because you know I'm the best person for the job.
And I won't run for another office while doing so.
Well, at that point I was a senior, so I couldn't.
That's true. Yeah, good point. So did you mention your predecessor a little bit? Did he or she take a strong of a role in elections before they decided to run for another office? Was this kind of the first time the high school had seen like enforcement of any existing rules and structure to a council election?
Um, I didn't really pay attention to any elections that happened before my tenure, honestly. This person, I don't know, she was pretty well liked. I don't think that the idea of running and being commissioner of elections was really thought of as a shenanigan. I think it was more thought of as an inconvenience. It's definitely something that shouldn't happen, but again, this is high school. I don't think people really cared. Generally, people don't care who the commissioner of elections is. I think it's one of 10 or 12 offices in student government that you would be hard pressed to, unless you knew someone who no one really knows who the student government cabinet is, and frankly, no one cares, and nor should they.
So I'll just encourage you, if you're listening in, to, as we're talking about this, you know, it might seem silly to have this in-depth conversation about high school council elections, but just listen as we're just asking the questions and think about anything relatable that's come up in previous election cycles, because, you know, we have issues every day that we're covering. We'll touch on ranked choice voting in this call, but that came up in Maine 2 cycles ago. And how do you kind of proceed in a situation that's brand new for statewide elections? What happens when a vote is tied in a state legislative election in Virginia? Did you know they pick a name from a hat? So just as we're going along, and please, if you have any questions, if you're in the Zoom chat, feel free to drop them in and I'll try to get to them. But just think about kind of how relatable this truly is. Do you know who runs your state board of elections? I work at Ballotpedia, and I don't think I could give you a single name. So yeah, it's really fascinating. What was the fatal flaw that caused this security breach? And can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like?
Sure, and actually I resent you saying that it's a fatal flaw, and I think
Fair.
I actually contend that it's pretty well designed. I mean, I designed it, so of course I would say that. But we had online voting, and I'm not dumb. If I thought this election mattered for shit, I wouldn't have instituted online voting. The truth of the matter is it was a high school, and our old system was incredibly effort intensive, so it was worth it to transition on to online voting. Actually built a pretty strong back end to the online voting that would filter out anyone who was voting with the wrong student ID number, or voting in the wrong grade, or trying to cast 2 ballots, or you know, any other shenanigans. And we actually, before this whole fraud incident, detected 30 or 40 ballots that were ineligible that way, basically automatically with no effort. So I don't know, I sort of resent saying that the system has a fatal flaw. I guess if anything, the fatal flaw is that people took it seriously, because you know, when you have online voting, it opens the door to insecurity, which we had basically assumed that no one would take the effort to, you know, throw the election, especially the steps that it took. Basically, if I'm informed correctly, I've been learning recently that, you know, some of my information is a little bit wrong, but my understanding is that the people who did this stayed up all night for like 16 hours straight of data entry. which I would say is probably objectively more work than the benefit they would have gained from it by putting it on, the college applications or whatever. I am a student government abolitionist, at least for high school, so I don't really want to say that, the position was important, but yeah. So if in the narrative of the podcast, the flaw is making elections online, which is clearly a mistake if the election matters. I think in really the flaw is just taking that election seriously.
So what can you, for anybody who didn't listen to the podcast, can you tell them what happened and how the candidate one was able to?
Sure, yeah. So candidate one committed identity theft on about 550 counts. They were not charged criminally, but maybe they should have been. They logged into people's emails in mass and voted for themselves over and over again. That is probably one of the most benign things they could have done with that information. They basically had access to 550 students' personal information. There was a case before at Berkeley High where someone logged into someone else's student ID number, someone's student email using this exact vulnerability and actually withdrew their applications to the University of California. So, in the long run, it was pretty benign, but they definitely had access and opportunity to do some horrible things. And, probably they were a minor at the time, so the disciplinary issues are complicated. But
yeah, the example you gave is pretty terrifying when you said, even aside the elections, it's probably a good thing that this was really brought to light, the potential for hijacking into somebody's email account this easily. Is there an election rule that you were interested in implementing that year that just didn't get pushed through, or was there anything else that you wanted to do with those elections that you weren't able to do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't subject to the democratic process. I basically did whatever I wanted to. I didn't have to get approval. So more or less everything I wanted was in there. If I had the opportunity, I probably would have further eliminated our election convention, which was basically the opportunity for candidates to give speeches and have them be recorded and put on the internet for no one to watch. It just didn't seem like a good use of anyone's time, especially because, all these people running are juniors. That's the most intensive year at Berkeley High, and they would have to deal with a lot of makeup work and basically ruin their schedule. But I used to be a Cub Scout. One of the things they taught me, the only thing they taught me basically that I remember, was how to fold an American flag. I think that was actually the biggest change that I instituted. Was at the election convention, there are two giant flags hanging from the rafters, and before they were folded in properly, and now they're folded properly, and that's about the sort of change that I like to make. That's basically pointless unless you care.
Okay, Drew. If hypothetically you did decide to really care about this and you could go back in time and run a little test experiment, what would you change in that A/B experiment?
What do you mean, like change in order to make the election better? Because I had free reign to do that, and I did.
I mean, knowing what you know now and the fraud that did happen, is there anything that you'd change, or what would that look like if you reran this entire election again?
Sure, yeah. So if my priority was security, I would go back to paper ballots. I'm not sure that's true, that my priority is security. The school, the year after I left, was planning to go back to paper ballots. I just don't think they wanted the embarrassment of their election being compromised twice in a row. But the truth is that their student ID numbers are actually pretty well protected. They had to do a bit of social engineering to get the list. It's not like they were publicly available. So my instinct would be that the system was pretty secure. In fact, after the pandemic caused them to not be able to do paper ballots, they just used my infrastructure again. Although my understanding is they made it a whole lot more difficult to vote because they were worried about this issue basically being embarrassed by it recurring again. So they started asking people for like their birthday and other bits of confirming information. I think that's probably too harsh. If anything, I stand by the system that I made, and I would use it again and again. Even, I could make specific changes that would have prevented this specific fraud, but I'm not sure in the long run, if you run dozens and dozens of elections, if they pay off inefficiency, what they lost in the fraud, which we detected. So.
Right, you guys did, you caught it. And I think your student or your teacher representative noticed the inconsistencies and you were able to deal with it. So I'm really curious. You're now on the elections committee at University of Chicago, and you seem to really be interested in this topic. Is there anything that you think is particularly relevant that happened at Berkeley High School that could translate to the broader nationwide elections? Like, what do you think are the most equivalent situations you're seeing between the two?
I don't know if there is an equivalent. I guess in terms of the method of the fraud, there's always the fear of election fraud, and I am by no means an expert in that. That could certainly happen, but I'm not. I think the podcast tried to paint a pretty clear story that this is 2016 in microcosm, right? We have all these characters. I'm not sure how valid that comparison really is. While they were interviewing me, they gave me many opportunities to compare the guy they called Zach to Trump, and no, that's not a fair comparison at all. Like, Trump is his own thing. Like, it's the old, when you bring up Hitler in an argument, you lose.
Right. And it was, yeah, you're absolutely right. So just for the listeners, there was a candidate who gave out some candy, and then there's this big personality, candidate one, Zach, who just had a big personality. I think at one point he would stop using the microphone and just broadcast his voice. And that comparison kept being made throughout. Which is a struggle if you're trying to just listen about the one incident and what happened there with the different reforms. But now, I think if I'm remembering correctly, you had was it something that you implemented about the size of the signs that could be in the hallways, or is that kind of an existing rule? I'm just even thinking about like how much campaigning there was for this, we call it inconsequential high school election. What did that really look like in reality? Was it kind of?
So, to be clear, the poster rule was one of our election rules, but is also just a restatement of the Berkeley High poster policy, which is not enforced at all. Basically, my understanding is the custodians of the high school feel like the walls are their territory, and they will take down posters. So a lot of the candidates were like anxious about that and blamed other candidates, when I think largely it was the custodians who were taking down their posters. There were a lot of posters the cycle that I had administered, the last one, because I think we had 70 candidates, something like that. It was just clear, far and away broke the record for how many candidates there are. And we think that was because we made the application form digital, and we lowered the restrictions for the information that that candidate needed to provide. So in some races, there were 17 candidates. And if you have 17 candidates and they each do some very low level of campaigning, for that race, you're going to have a total, you're going to seem overwhelmed, even if each candidate really isn't putting that much effort into their campaign. There were certainly, the front runners that they covered were certainly going far and beyond and trying to, get their names out there above the rising baseline. So because there's more candidates, you have to shout louder to be noticed. I guess it's probably the atmosphere of, everyone wants to run, and all of a sudden the bar to running is lower. That created I think that, assuming that the elections are intense from the amount of advertising, is not the assumption you want to make. You want to look at the content of the advertising, and I think it was relatively tame. Vote for me. Of course, I didn't really agree with the rule, but I happily wrote it down and said it was there. Berkeley High doesn't do negative campaigning. That's a huge free speech violation, but it's high school, who gives a shit? So they were basically enjoined from writing bad things on their posters about each other. So it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, ballot access laws, they vary by state, and thinking about ballot exhaustion, that's a real thing California can sometimes have upwards of 17 ballot measures on a ballot every cycle. So even when you take it down to the super micro, the most local of local governments in a school, thinking about that as a top issue there as well. It's really fascinating that it can translate between those two very vastly different levels of government. Okay, so ranked choice voting, you talked about this. You mentioned that it's a topic you love. I would love to hear from you, just because this is your interest. What do you think are the pros and cons of ranked choice voting? And why would you think it would work in a student government election? Is there a level of government that you don't think it would work at? It's a topic we love to talk about at Ballotpedia, and I think that's probably why a lot of staffers tuned in very deeply and related to you as the love of ranked choice voting discussions.
Sure. Let me just say that actually my love of ranked choice voting isn't necessarily a love because it's better. It's a love because it's more interesting. Right. Ranked choice voting, it just adds additional steps of, probably needlessly contrived drama to an election. And that's why I like it. The reason that I instituted it at Berkeley High was because the election was my plaything, didn't really matter, and I could do whatever I wanted to make it seem more interesting to me, which is, sad to hear someone running your election say, but also happened to be true. It's probably also sad to hear someone running your election say that your position shouldn't exist, which is true for every single elected position. But, what are you going to do? As in terms of would ranked choice voting work on the larger scale? I don't know. The city of Berkeley uses ranked choice voting. That was actually the official reason that we used the ranked choice voting in high school, because, there's this idea that, high school elections are supposed to prepare you in some meaningful way for being an actual good citizen, which we've seen from this is not true. That, if you're being prepared to be a citizen of Berkeley, you ought to know how ranked choice voting works. And that's how we basically sold it to the public, even though, it was mostly just for my entertainment. Do I think it would work in larger scenarios? Well, it'd be interesting to see what Maine does. But I think generally the trade-off is a lot higher voter information costs for a slightly more accurate result. Everyone who I've seen promoting ranked choice voting, I think is sort of promoting it with the idea that, there's some injustice in elections, and specifically that injustice is the candidates they like don't win as often. And with ranked choice voting, the candidates that they like will win slightly more often, therefore it's better. They don't say that outright, but that's what they're really saying. So in terms of the information costs of ranked choice voting, imagine using it in something like the primary, the Democratic primary. Right now, tell me, who's your 13th choice? Do you know? Who's your 12th choice? Who's your 11th choice? All of a sudden you have to expend so much more effort in making a decision that will basically ultimately be the same, especially in a race like this, where essentially the least dangerous option won, right? That was ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting basically played itself out in real time anyway, with candidates who weren't popular dropping out. So why do you need it?
Yeah, very true. All right, so this, just because you're interested in this topic, and you seem like a chaos agent, which I personally love. What if you had a magic wand to wave one election reform across the country, what would it be and why?
I don't know. I would probably want to, as you said, I'm not convinced that people who really think they know what their reform would do are right. I mentioned for ranked choice voting, I think there are all these examples of people are saying, Republicans are opposing DC statehood because they have some idea of like how DC would vote, whereas they were completely wrong with how Alaska and Hawaii ended up voting in the long term when they were become states. Like, it's not really clear that everyone who's suggesting election reforms completely knows the consequences that they would get, even if they're not the ones that they would want. So I would probably just try to, do something incredibly weird and see how it works in the United States. Like, for 1 year, we just use the parliamentary system, see what would happen, and then switch back. I don't know. Just inflicting chaos upon the system, as you said, is probably what I would do, just to see what happens. I went to see the Iowa caucuses this year by walking across the street and looking at a satellite caucus that was happening in Chicago. And one of the things I remember telling someone there was like, something like Trump is incredibly interesting to me, were it not happening right now. Just seeing how the system responds to shocks, right?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that a lot this cycle too, because there is just this mass flurry of election reform kind of being slowly trickled in because of the change of in-person voting in Corona and everything like that. So we're experiencing a lot of these little shockwaves right now. Is there any other topic on election reform that you have as much of an interest in as ranked choice voting, or even, like you mentioned, even just the system of government? What else, like if you scroll through Wikipedia late at night, or Ballotpedia, hopefully, what election reform topics are you most interested in?
I mean, that's mostly it. I don't think I'm definitely not one of those, social choice theory people who, spends a lot of time thinking about this. I spend much higher than average, but also not very high in the grand scheme of things, time thinking about stuff like this.
You probably,
I think it would be,
even if you spend an hour a year thinking about this, you're probably thinking about it about 3,000 times more than the average.
That's why I said much higher than average, yes. I don't know. I would very much like to see how the country would fare under mandatory voting. It would probably be horrible. Kanye West might be president right now, but that's at least an interesting and novel result.
Yeah, that would be an interesting shock to the system to test out, going back to that previous question, for sure. Okay, so like we mentioned, you sit on the Board of Elections or Committee for Elections at Chicago. Are you, is this going to translate into a career path? Or, I mean, you keep kind of saying you're not super interested in this, but you seem to keep involving yourself in these elections. So what's your end goal? Do you want to keep talking about these issues? What do you think you're going to be doing in 5 years or 10 years? Or,
I mean, the truth is, I don't know. I think there's lots of ways that it can go, right? I could keep doing this. I could do something else entirely. I do a lot of things, and quite a lot of the things that I do that people, project, that I might have some future. I don't know what classes I'm going to take in college next year, right? I don't know anything. Especially my past has shown that I'm incredibly bad at predicting things. If you asked me when I was 5 if I would ever wear hats, I would say no. 5 years is something like more than a quarter of my life, right? That's I do competitive trivia, not well, but I do it. And one of the things that I hate most in the world is being wrong. Any answer that I give to this question will be wrong.
That's very accurate. That's the most correct answer you could say to that. Okay, so one, I would encourage you, if whenever you go on to own a house or a condo or anything, join your HOA to then dismantle it from the inside. I did at a previous location. That was really fun, and I think it's something that you'd enjoy. There's my life suggestion for you. But then, okay, you just seem to have a wide variety of interests, and it's summer, and I want to know what books you're reading. I just kind of want to gauge just where your mind goes in different times, and what are you reading, or like what's your favorite thing to be exploring right now? Completely.
Sure, yeah. I haven't read books in a long time, except for here we go, free product placement. This is sci-fi. This is the last book in a 3-book series, The Last Emperor by John Scalzi. So it's part of a 3-part sci-fi trilogy that people say is about climate change, and he swears is not. I don't really know how to pitch it besides it's hilarious and you should read it. I tend not to read, important books. I don't know. I don't know what they do besides make you feel smart, and I have a problem, which is that I am very overconfident in how smart I am. So, I don't really need that sort of reinforcement. If anything, I need someone to tell me I'm dumb every so often, right? I don't understand, I think, the idea that, I guess it's more clear with people who publish political books. Either you can look at that as a signal that they're running for president immediately. It's clearly written by someone else, and it's mostly just to sell books and get their name out there. Yeah, I don't read books like that. I read stuff that make me smile, and I tend not to read nonfiction at all unless it's incredibly either if it's for a paper. If it's for a paper and it's nonfiction, that I will also take pains to make sure that it's something that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't actually read a lot, which is sad, I guess, but true.
Well, I mean, doing and reading, you got to balance it out. Do you have like a favorite, just from the research you've been doing, just to have your positions now currently, but then also at Berkeley? Do you have like a favorite prior election story, just from the history of elections in the country or globally? Is there one story that kind of stuck out to you that's particularly fun about any election cycles pre-2016, we'll say?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that I guess jump out to me are the Pirate Party in Iceland that basically grew from nothing to become a major force in their geopolitical system. That started as like basically an internet joke, is my understanding, and then became somewhat of an actual force in their political system. I don't know how well they're doing now. Also, I mean, it's less like novel and it's less funny, but just what Macron did in the start of his campaign in France, where he basically completely started a new political party from scratch and won. I mean, that had a bunch of extraneous or underlying circumstances for that. So I don't know how replicable it is, but
Yeah, the idea of just what our third party system looks like in America, and at some point there's got to be, we see parties shifting a lot since the inception of our own republic. So at what point are we going to have another party shift? That could happen fairly soon in this country, or at least a different alignment or something like that. And I think that's kind of that shockwave post-Trump that we might be able to evaluate in the next decade or two.
I don't know. I feel like the smart money is always betting against something like that.
Mm-hmm. It has been. Yep, you're right. Well, so that's all the questions that I had. Thank you for joining us, Robert Ezra. Is there any like parting words of wisdom? Just, you seem pretty cynical about those elections, but it's still always kind of fun to hear that people under 60 are talking about election reform issues. So do you have any kind of optimism for us about elections?
I don't know. However it is that you want elections to be, you are one of whatever the denominator is, and you get to make that change. I don't know.
Yeah.
I
Listen,
take whatever optimism and idealism you have, and multiply it by the fraction of the country that you are, and congratulations, you've exerted that change. I mean, that's democracy, right? You know, that's about as motivational as I feel I can be without selling out.
That's fair. And it does sound trite, but like there are elections decided by tiebreakers. So that's my little optimistic Ballotpedia plug is, you know, it may seem overwhelming, especially in a presidential year where we're talking about electoral votes and millions of people voting, but don't forget about your local elections. Don't forget about your county councilman and everything like that, your local school board. Because yeah, you have as much impact as you do at the local level. The denominator gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you go down. Well, thanks for joining us today, Robert Ezra. This is Ballotpedia Insights. If you have any suggestions for a fun topic, discussion, a book you've read recently on politics that you love, please let us know at editor@ballotpedia.org. Again, anything that we talk about in these insights, please remember that Ballotpedia itself is neutral and nonpartisan. And if you have any suggestions for speakers, please let me know. Feel free to sign up at ballotpedia.org for all of our newsletters. They're going to be crucial as we head into the last few days of this election cycle. Stay on track of who's running on your ballot with our sample ballot. We have a new app called My Vote, and you can save all the people and ballot measures that you're voting for right on the app, so you don't get to the election booth and go, crap, I can't remember who I decided to vote for. So please check us out. Please use us in these final weeks. And thank you, Robert Ezra, for taking the time. This was really fun for me and of course our Ballotpedia staff and listeners today.
Sure.
Thanks guys, talk to y'all soon.